Hey, welcome back. As I mentioned, I'm obviously not here today because I'm home with my wife. I will be back on Friday, but there are a couple things you need to do this week uh, by the just as part of that situation. The first of all is a quiz on Chapter 2, and it should be available in Canvas today. And you need to complete that quiz before Friday, before you come to class. We'll talk about it on Friday. Um, the other thing you need to work on this week is communication challenge number 1. I don't think you can see this very well. Um, it's part of chapter 3. So you need to make sure that you review chapter 3 first. Um, and then if you recall your self-reflection assessment that you did, uh, you should be able to answer those questions, the questions on this challenge related to that. So, like the first question asks, whom did you identify in the interpersonal communication self-assessment as wanting to learn how to improve your communication with? If you mention that, or even if you look at your score and try to remember the person you had in mind when you did that, you should be able to use that situation that you had in mind when you thought of that score that you gave it. Look back on that and try to use that person as your model for why the self concept issue you may be experiencing, the self concept issues you are, and so forth. So you'll be asked to identify how self talk, make sure you look that up, affects your interaction. Then number 3 is describe your self concept in relationship to that person. Also, identify at least 2 negative self fulfilling prophecies that affect your ability to communicate. We'll talk about those today. And then identify at least 2 positive self fulfilling prophecies that you can create to improve your communication with that person. All right. So, with those in mind, do this in sentence form, not bullet points, but sentence form. And you could probably write maybe a paragraph each for each. So, uh, 3 to 4 sentences in a paragraph. The reason I have you do that is because we're building up later on for an essay that you'll do and a presentation where you'll talk about reviewing your self assessment as well as all these challenges and how they played and how you've been hopefully been able to improve that. So make sure you do that. I think that's due Sunday. So make sure you take the time to do that. Again, quiz also before Friday, challenge number 1 on Sunday. Okay. So let me go ahead and bring up my slides. And Windows or tab. Well, let me dig this back up. All right. So we are talking about chapter 3, communication and identity, creating and presenting the self. And I mentioned some of the objectives you should be able to do this week. We're going to look at about the first 4, I believe, that we're going to look at. So we're going to look at that relationship between self and self-esteem and communication. And we're going to define those in just a second. Then we're going to look at how self fulfilling prophecies shape the self concept and influence communication. We're going to compare and contrast perceived self and presenting self as they relate to impression management. And I'll explain my relationship to impression management in just a minute. And then describe the role that impression management plays in both face to face and mediated relationships. So that's where we kind of get into social media as well, that we talked about last week. Now, so how do we define self? We define that as our identity. It's really how we see ourselves. And communication plays a major role in how we see ourselves and how we want others to see us and tell us how they see us. Keep that in mind because we have an identity that we've formed. Other people have their own sense of our identity, and they may not be equal in many ways. So let's do a couple of definitions first. Self concept is that set of perceptions we hold about ourselves and you have about yourself. And these perceptions are relatively stable. We can change them, but sometimes they can be difficult. So, anytime you see yourself, whether it's positive or negative, if we want to change that, maybe if we have a positive self image, it may not take very much to bring us down a little bit, but sometimes we'll rebound from that because we are kind of resilient and elastic when it comes to uh, changing our view of ourselves. But if it's negative, it can be very hard to change. And so we're going to kind of look at some of that. Self esteem, on the other hand, is our evaluations of our self worth. And generally, it's measured in terms of high or low esteem. And many times it's influenced by those around us. It's based on our experience and self evaluations are usually influenced by someone's self esteem. All right. Experience is a big part of it, but many times um, they are based on a lot of formation that goes on, our experience and how we see ourselves. And some of that is a very positive and negative cycle. If you go to page 64 in your text, it talks about how it shows these cycles that we have down here, how there is both a positive cycle that gets reinforced and a negative cycle, which could become a spiral, but depending on how these cycles interact, they can really influence how you see things. Now, our self, our vision of ourself, our concept and our self-esteem is really rooted not only in our biology, but in our society as well. Uh, Social interaction does is a big influence on our self-esteem, but really many times it's biological. It's seen as your particular personality, um, how it can impact things um, in your life, uh, and maybe challenge you even with before you can do anything. So we as far as biology and the self, when we talk about that, we're mainly looking at our personality, the idea that uh, that flexible, dynamic characteristic of the ways we think and behave uh, in a variety of situations. Sometimes is based on experience. Sometimes it's based on what our body's going through, and uh, certain behaviors that you uh, are inherent that are inherent to you. The most obvious one are the physical traits that we have. That's kind of the biological communication related behaviors that we're sort of born into, such as introversion or extroversion. Extroversion, or if you're outward going, and you're in that terms, or if you're shy, which is kind of the opposite of that. If you're assertive, which is more extroversion, or you may be verbally aggressive, uh, or have a tendency to that, um, or whether or not you have a willingness to communicate in characteristic ways. Certainly, an aspect of the biological traits that you might have if you're experiencing a hearing loss, as some of you have mentioned. That can reflect on how you interact with other people, and certainly that can be a problem, uh, or at least show up and influence your not only your self concept but also your self esteem. But some of these other behaviors as well that aren't necessarily tied to a particular uh, function within your body. It's kind of the way you were raised, or um, something about internally that's creating that in you. Um, Whereas the concept of socialization, uh, as a formation of self concept, that's when you get messages from other people that shape how we regard ourselves. Uh, and the way we do that is through a reflected appraisal, or what we've called in the past the looking glass self. How we reflect the way we believe others see us. And so it's important, uh, just as uh, this recording is attempting to mirror me, um, we tend to see a mirror reflection of ourselves through other people. All right. But if you were to compare it to a mirror, it's probably a very old mirror that some of the silver on the backing of the mirror has worn off. And so it's a little distorted. Maybe the glass is warped a little bit. And so it, it looks different than what we expect ourselves to look. And so I think that's important to keep in mind. It's not a bad, it's not a bad reflection on you. It's just when it goes through other people, it's filtered a little bit. And so we have to be willing to look at that slightly different. Now, some of the people that most influences are those significant others, those people who have the greatest influence on us. Um, Mostly our parents, our significant others, our siblings, those people who either influence us for the good or influence us for the bad. And the text kind of talks about two types. One called ego boosters, those who strengthen our self image, and the ego busters, who kind of tear us down. So keep those terms in mind as you're doing your communication challenge. You'll want to make sure who you're reflecting on, and share them equally. because sometimes those significant others can either may have one that builds us up and others that bring us down. And that kind of leaves us in a dangerous place unless one has a stronger influence than the other. Then there's also social comparisons that we may have. And those social comparisons uh, are when we tend to evaluate ourselves in terms of how we compare ourselves with others. And there's different groups and different relationships that we have. Um, so uh, we may have one group uh, that are better or worse than others. We call those the superior inferior groups that either for better or worse are influences by drafting us into kind of polar opposites, uh, making us feel better or bringing us down. Uh, and those are outside of those significant others. So these are people outside of that where we have this social comparison and we're evaluated on how we compare to others. And this is kind of seen as one of the driving factors within the negative factors within social media. I should hope, but hopefully there are also some positive ones as well. And those influencers are the ones that do try to make us feel better or worse than others, whether it means we're attractive or ugly, whether we're successful or a failure, whether we're intelligent or whether we're stupid. All right. So really that is a values oriented evaluation, how we get compared in a positive or negative light. Um, the second one is whether or not we are same or different than everyone else. We try to compare ourselves with other people. Are we similar to them? Are we completely different? And a lot of times, as once we reach that teen years where we're kind of comparing ourselves within the social hierarchy of middle school or high school, we're trying to compare ourselves with others. Uh, in the same ways, whether we're trying to compare ourselves, whether we're superior or inferior, it's our evaluation, so we have to do that carefully. And within that, as as the slide shows, there are reference groups. These reference groups are those people that we compare ourselves with in terms of levels of significance. So depending on who we're referring to, who we think are our models for the ideal, those are the people that we're trying to draw some decision on. And so it's important that we, identify who our reference groups are. Who do we identify with? Is it other soccer players or is it Premier League players that we're comparing ourselves to? Um, is are they those social influencers we're following on Instagram, or are they uh, our family that we share photos with on Facebook, for example? Now, there's an interesting group, uh, not really a group, but there's a form of relationship that we develop that's been studied. Uh, and particularly, I was part of some of this studies in my doctoral program where people develop parasocial relationships, where this is when people form relationships with others that they admire that can lead to what's called social modeling. And there have been studies going back quite a long ways in the 60s and 70s. So it's been 50, about 50 years or so that these studies have been going on, where particularly within media contexts, we recognize characters that we relate to. And originally, these studies came out of studying violent behavior. But what they found is that there are positive parasocial relationships that we have that have led to positive outcomes. There are some that turn out to be negative, but not as much related to violence as it is other things, but still quite possible. Um, One of my professors did a number of studies of things, particularly on people who model themselves after Elvis. And what they found is that followers of Elvis have kind of modeled this image of themselves as Elvis impersonators to the point where they do the visual stuff. They dress like Elvis, they talk like Elvis, they sing their songs, they sing his songs, they go to conventions, they make personal appearances dressed as Elvis. Um, and there was, there's a Mexican Elvis and baby Elvises. And one of the things they found is one of the things that they do as part of that parasocial relationship with the king is that they actually try to do some of they they try to make people happy. They don't try to use it necessarily for their own profit, but they saw that Elvis was a charitable man as well, and they do charitable things for them. And it's really interesting to see some of those parasocial relationships. On the other hand, uh, another professor that I worked with, he studied parasocial relationships among athletes who modeled themselves after Mark McGuire. And the negative outcome from that was actually them reflecting on McGuire's use of steroids. And they wanted to be like Mark McGuire. And in doing so, they were using illegal anabolic steroids, and it led to health issues and so forth. And because so it can develop into a very negative relationship. So uh, if you recognize some of these parasocial relationships, if you identify with a film character or an actor particularly, um, and you follow them a lot, it can lead to either you can model yourself after them to the point where you become and you reflect some of their behaviors for good or bad. And that's something certainly to keep in mind. Now, let's talk a little bit about some of the characteristics of what self concept is. It's very subjective. And we think of objective things as being better in some ways, but they're not always better. Sometimes subjectivity is important for our development. And while we think that our self esteem or our self concept is accurate, uh, more times than not, it can be a little distorted. Okay. And it could be distorted in both ways. You know, um, we tend to imagine ourselves how we see ourselves, and sometimes it's considered an ideal and not necessarily um, perfect. And mainly this is caused by the fact that we're using obsolete information. Many times We fall back on those past failures that tend to linger in our mind and that have occurred, and we sit on those and not the things that we're doing now, those accomplishments or those deeds that we've done that have been good and positive. And we linger on those failures more than we do on our successes, or just the opposite. Sometimes we fall back on our successes, but what have we done lately? Okay. And so it does tend to distort how we see ourselves. And we have to be careful about that. We can also distort the feedback that we not only give ourselves, but uh, also take from other people. If we had overcritical parents or overly praising parents, that tends to distort how others see us. Maybe teachers' comments that could bend our perception of ourselves. I try to be very careful about how I comment on your homework, uh, particularly when I'm doing speech assessment. I want to point out specifics that could use improvement. I try to highlight those things that are praiseful. So I try to balance those, but I don't want people to reflect always on the negative. Uh, but we have to be careful of the possibility that our feedback is distorted as well. And how we receive that can be an influence on it. We do have to be aware of this emphasis on perfection, because it can also distort us a little bit. If we're pushed to perfection, it can impact our self concept. We may see more things as failure because we're not to that bar of perfection yet. But we should be willing to deal with a little bit of challenge to our growth. So uh, if you're not being challenged, you may assume that you're doing everything well, uh, whereas the opposite could be the case. So we always have to kind of measure that very carefully. And finally, our social expectations, those societal rewards. Generally, society rewards modesty, um, and sometimes that can lead people to a false sense of modesty and create perceptions of what we call imposter syndromes. Um, if, as I said, we feel that we're doing things well, uh, it may be what we may see as success may only be mediocrity. And so if we see ourselves as only being mediocre, kind of in between, we're not fully self actualized, we're not fully arrived at the level of skill that we might have at a job or in our academic life. And so we may assume that when we do reach failure, oh, I've just been playing. I'm not really good at this. And so this idea of an imposter syndrome has developed a lot lately because many times we see ourselves failing at at attempts to achieve another level, and then when it doesn't go through, we feel like we're an imposter. So this idea of self-deprivation that we have uh, to defend ourselves is kind of a mechanism that we have when we deal with success and failure. Um, if we're successful, we try to be modest according to society because they tend to reward that. If we try to praise ourselves, we're boastful and we're too big for our britches, as they say. Um, but when we fail, what do? Sometimes we blame other people. and not ourselves. So we do have to have a little bit of realism there, and so it's important to be able to do that. And this is kind of where computer and internet mediation. Um, we also have to take in the same considerations we have for ourselves based on what other people are providing us on the internet and so forth. Um, the same thing. It's kind of distorted feedback. It's either highly positive or it's highly critical. And so we do have to kind of measure that carefully as we move forward and put that on within our uh, level of self concept. So, some of the characteristics of self concept is that it does tend to resist change, uh, and what they refer to as cognitive conservatism. That's where we try to look for confirmation that confirms our existing self concept. Um, and this is actually considered a logical fallacy of communication bias. Many times we look for those things that confirm our self esteem. And so, in the same way, we can get self reflected stuff back from other people, we can also get that in an attempt for ourselves to look through our self concept and find all those things that reinforce our self concept, but may not necessarily be how other people see that. Um, and you'll hear this term confirmation bias in the political realm as well, where uh, many times, depending on the political swing of a candidate or so forth, they will only reflect those things that confirm how they see themselves and how they see others, and not necessarily look at all the facts and find out all the things that are going on. Uh, so if a particular candidate lost, uh, but there are indications out there that there might have been some voter fraud out there. There was one instance of voter fraud, so that must mean the election was stolen from me. Okay. So it's kind of confirming things in their favor, uh, and so protecting their self concept more than actually what's going on. Okay. And changing a distorted self concept is really a good thing. And it can help you move towards a positive self concept. And here are some other things as well that help embrace that more positive concept. Try to have a realistic perception of yourself. Listen to the supportive friends that you have. Recognize your strengths. Challenge them if you think they're just making things easy for you. Don't be afraid to, you know, also take compliments at face value. You may have had those overly praising parents, and that's fine. Uh, but did they also have criticisms for you? If they did, were they genuine? Um, and balance that. But if they were overcritical, did they also praise you? And were they as sincere with the praise as they are with the criticism? Uh, because parents and children always struggle with each other uh, as they're growing up. But there'll come a time, and I've seen this with my own children. Uh, that despite the times I was critical, and maybe to their more to their credit than to mine, uh, they become strong, confident adults and parents. And I think, once you're given a little bit of time and not only self reflection, but also engagement with those other people, I think you'll start to see how realistic your uh, their concept, their reflection of you is, and hopefully that will make a more positive reflection on yourself. Have realistic expectations. Weigh your successes honestly. You know, maybe it was the team working together, and I did contribute, but I wasn't the only person. So measure that honestly with yourself. Um, Measure your improvements as well. If you're trying to improve, make sure you try to judge that honestly and sincerely. Be sure to have the will to change. Be motivated. And that's really essential to make those changes. So, motivation is when you turn your concern into action. Are you putting it to work? Are you actually making progress? Um, and that's important. You got to have the will to change that. But you also have to have the skill to change that. So, seek advice, model others' behaviors that are positive, and adapt those behaviors to your own style. It takes practice, it takes time. Um, I wouldn't be surprised, based on some of the memes that are on TikTok, that there are some women that want to be Beth Dutton from Yellowstone. There are some guys that want to be Rip from Yellowstone. Also, um, I'm wondering if there are Native Americans that want to be like the Native American characters on that, both men and women. All right. Again, I don't know. It's yet to see if any of those last, but certainly some of the memes where they, watch one episode of Yellowstone and after they've watched the season, they're completely transformed into a cowboy or a Beth Dutton or something like that. But you never know. That could quite be possible. Right? But you have to have the will and the skill to change your behavior. Now, family, culture, and others influence our identities. We've kind of alluded to that, but in a broader sense, kind of the situations we've had with individual modeling, or that concept of social modeling, uh, is really what we refer to as what the culture does to us. And when we refer to culture, we're talking about the community, whether it's ethnic and or racial groups that have traditions, and those traditions influence us. They could be individualistic, like the Westerns, where there's a lot of self-reliance and the use of I. And that's it's still very popular today, has been ever since the media picked up on the life of the cowboy and the frontier mentality that we've had. Very individualistic. And when I say Western, I'm not just saying the Western, but Western, what we refer to as Western civilization. Um, Anything to the west of Istanbul, in a sense. So basically, European America and anything that was influenced by that, including Central and South America. And what's interesting is Africa is separate from that. So I wouldn't say due south, but uh, certainly anything that had European influence is seen as being self reliant, particularly the United States and the Northern Hemisphere. But a certain amount of that also goes south of the border as well. Uh, and that idea of individualism, it's not as prevalent, but certainly it is influenced because of the European nature of that, as opposed to collectivism, which is actually a trait of Asian cultures where they identify as groups, the we, and in certain sense, Africa as well, probably within that. There's probably a more of a sense of collectivism because of the tribal traditions that still exist within Africa and so forth. At least those portions of Africa that have been able to move away from European influence. But also, sex and gender can also be a, this idea of. So, when I was talking about collectivism, we're referring to that co cultural identity that many people have. And by gender, we're referring to the different messages that are aimed between males and females. And one thing, the distinction we want to make is sex refers to biology. When we use that term, we're talking about biologically how, who is who. Um, Purely from a biological standpoint. That's what we refer to when we use the term sex. Gender, however, that refers to identity. And that includes the use of pronouns and expressions of behavior and expectations. And many times, our esteem is more influenced by gender than by biology. And so, because our biology is a certain way, may also reflect on how we identify. But for the most part, it's self esteem is influenced more by the gender because that has to do with how we identify. The last thing I want to talk about today is the self fulfilling prophecy. What is that? And how is that a communications event? Well, a self fulfilling prophecy is when a person's expectations of an event and their behavior based on their expectations make an event more likely to occur than otherwise would have been true. And to this is kind of epitomized by it's was first kind of at least within Western culture, it was kind of immortalized by the Greek myth about Pygmalion. Pygmalion was an artist, a sculptor, and he had dreamed of this ideal woman that he wanted to sculpt. And so he made the sculpture, this statue, and he fell in love with it. And he just would stare at it for hours, and eventually his expectations, according to mythology, the gods felt pity on Pygmalion, and they had the statue come to life. Uh, and sometimes this is referred to as the Pygmalion effect, where, and we'll talk about the difference between what self-fulfilling prophecy is and what the Pygmalion effect is, because there's actually two different ones. When we talk about self-fulfilling prophecy, we're talking about a person's expectations. So if you believe you can create um, something, eventually your behavior will reflect that and it'll actually bring it to fruition. Okay. That's where you hold an expectation for yourself. You then behave within those expectations. And then the expectations actually come to pass. You actually achieve what you're striving for. And it reinforces the original expectation. Just you allow it to come lost. And this can be both positive and negative. You say, what do I need to do? Okay. So I need to read my book. I need to do all my assignments on time. I need to be in class and take notes. And if I do all those things, I'll get an A. Now, what happens if suddenly you start to have, oh, I forgot to do the reading. Oh, if you start realizing that, it could negative spiral in the same way that your self positive spins and negative spins. Eventually, you can work your way out of that. And so, self fulfilling prophecy can be both positive, but if you move forward with positive expectations and positive behaviors, and you bring expectations to pass, you'll reach that goal that you're eventually going to get. Now, if you get expectations on you by someone else, that's what we call the Pygmalion effect. Just like the sculptor, his expectations on that statue, and eventually, of course, the gods intervened like they always do in Greek mythology. But there was actually a study that was done by Rosenthal and Jacobson. I think it was back in the 60s or early 70s, called Pygmalion in the Classroom, where if students imposed their own expectations, it influenced their behaviors. But also, if the teachers influenced them or their classmates influenced them, it also created expectations for other people. Okay, so uh, explain and communicate expectations for the students and other students, colleagues may either be positive or negative towards you, and they can also influence your behavior. In either case, you as the observer, or in the case of the Pygmalion, as the observer, you must communicate those expectations to that person. All right. It's important to be able to do that. And that can have a great influence on who you are and the self concept that you have along with it. All right. So, just to see kind of what we'll talk about on Friday, we'll talk about presenting yourself and how you present yourself outwardly to others. And we'll do that under what we refer to as impression management. All right. Sure that you take care of that quiz this week. And then also make sure that you take a look at the communication challenge, reflect, go back on your look at those goals that you had or how you particularly related that element of chapter 3 in that self reflection, and start to put that together by Sunday. All right. Thanks very much for your time, and we will see you on Friday. All right.